Margaret had been living alone for many years since her husband passed away. The silence in the house had become overwhelming, and loneliness weighed on her more than ever. She often found herself longing for company, someone to fill the emptiness that had settled into her days. One afternoon, she decided to visit her only son, Richard, hoping to find comfort in being around family. When she arrived at his home, she sat down with him and poured out her feelings. She told him how difficult it had become to live alone, how every corner of the house reminded her of what she had lost. "I've been by myself for so long," she said, her voice heavy with sadness. "Since your father died, the house feels empty, and I just need someone to be with. I miss having a little one around." Richard listened to his mother with concern. He knew she was lonely and wanted to help. After discussing it with his wife, Elizabeth, they agreed that their 5-year-old son, Daniel, could stay with Margaret for a while. They believed it would be good for both of them. Daniel would get to know his grandmother better, and Margaret would have the companionship she longed for. Daniel, unaware of the deeper reasons behind the arrangement, was simply excited. The idea of spending time at his grandmother's house felt like an adventure to him. He packed a small bag, eager to explore a new environment, and left with Margaret that evening. Margaret welcomed Daniel warmly, making sure he felt at home. At first, everything seemed perfectly normal. She cooked his favorite meals, read him bedtime stories, and tucked him in at night with gentle care. Daniel, in turn, enjoyed the attention and the change of scenery. The house, once filled with silence, now echoed with laughter and playful footsteps. But as the days passed, something began to shift. The initial joy that Margaret had felt started to fade. Even with Daniel in the house, the loneliness that had haunted her for years crept back in. A strange emptiness took hold of her, an unsettling feeling she couldn't quite explain. Whenever Daniel took a bath, Margaret found herself lingering nearby. She would glance through the slightly open door, watching him with eyes that held something more than just the usual concern of a grandmother. At first, she told herself she was just making sure he was safe. But deep down, she knew there was something wrong with the way she was feeling. Each time she watched him, her thoughts darkened. The loneliness that had once only gnawed at her heart began twisting into something else, something she could not name. The innocent joy of having her grandson around was becoming tainted. She no longer saw Daniel just as a little boy she loved. He was starting to feel like something more, something that could fill the void she had carried for so long. The more she watched him, the more she struggled with her emotions. She knew these feelings were not right, but she could not push them away. And as the days passed, Daniel began to notice something strange about his grandmother. One afternoon, while taking his bath, he looked up and saw Margaret standing in the doorway. She wasn't just peeking in to check on him, she was staring. The way she looked at him made him feel uneasy, though he didn't understand why. It wasn't like when his parents checked on him, making sure he hadn't spilled water on the floor. There was something different in the way she watched him, something he couldn't put into words. That evening, Daniel decided to ask her about it. He was a curious child and didn't like feeling confused. So, in his usual innocent way, he turned to his grandmother and asked, "Grandma, why do you keep looking at me like that?" Margaret hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words. Then she smiled, reaching out to stroke his cheek. "I love you very much, Daniel," she said. "More than you can imagine. You make me happier than I've been in years." Her voice was soft but intense. "I wish you could stay with me forever." Daniel, still too young to understand the deeper meaning behind her words, felt warmth in his heart. He loved his grandmother too, and if staying with her made her happy, then he was glad. He grinned and told her that he loved being with her. Meanwhile, back at Richard's house, things were not as peaceful. Elizabeth had never been entirely comfortable with Daniel staying at Margaret's house. She had always felt a certain unease around her mother-in-law, though she could never explain why. It was just a feeling, something deep in her gut that she couldn't ignore. As the days went by, her anxiety grew. She missed her son terribly and began to regret agreeing to let him stay for so long. Something felt wrong, though she couldn't put her finger on it. Every time she thought about Daniel being alone with Margaret, an unsettling feeling settled in her chest. One morning, Elizabeth decided she couldn't take it anymore. She turned to Richard and said, "I'm going to get Daniel and bring him home." Richard tried to reassure her. "Elizabeth, he's fine. He's just having fun with his grandmother," he said, hoping to ease her worries. But Elizabeth shook her head. "No, I don't feel right about this. I need to see him." Richard could see that there was no changing her mind. So, he let her go. When Elizabeth arrived at Margaret's house, her heart was pounding. She had been bracing herself for something, though she didn't know what. But as she stepped into the yard, relief washed over her. There was Daniel, playing outside with a few neighborhood children, laughing and chasing after a ball. For a moment, she felt foolish. Maybe she had overreacted. Maybe Richard was right. But deep inside, the unease hadn't completely disappeared. She watched her son carefully, making a mental note to bring him home no matter what. Elizabeth watched Daniel run around, laughing and playing with his new friends. He looked happy and full of life, which made her feel a pang of guilt. Maybe she had been overthinking things. Maybe she had let her fears cloud her judgment. She had come expecting to take him home, sure that he would be eager to leave, but when she walked over to him and told him it was time to go, he surprised her. "I don't want to leave yet," Daniel said firmly. "I like it here. Grandma takes good care of me, and I have new friends." Elizabeth blinked in surprise. Daniel had always been attached to her, always eager to come home whenever he was away. Yet now, he was choosing to stay. She knelt down, brushing a hand over his curls. "Sweetheart, your father and I miss you. We want you to come home." Daniel shook his head. "But I'm happy here." For a moment, Elizabeth didn't know what to do. She didn't want to force him if he was genuinely happy. But something still didn't sit right with her. As the days passed, Margaret's attachment to Daniel only grew stronger. She began making small, odd requests. She asked him to be in her room while she got dressed, saying she needed help picking out clothes or fetching things for her. Daniel, being young and trusting, didn't question it. He would sit quietly, sometimes turning his face away when she changed, believing it was normal. At first, it all seemed harmless. But then, Margaret's behavior shifted. The way she touched him became strange, at first fleeting, small gestures that confused him. He didn't know why they made him uncomfortable, only that they did. But he didn't question it. This was his grandmother. He trusted her. Each time he hesitated, Margaret reassured him with soft words. "I love you very much, Daniel. This is just how I show it." He was too young to fully understand. He only knew that love was supposed to feel good, and she said she loved him more than anyone. So, he accepted it. He told no one, not even his parents or friends, because Margaret had told him it was their special secret. He believed her. Over the years, what had started as small, confusing moments became something far worse. And as Daniel grew older, the unease inside him grew as well. By the time he was 15, he could no longer pretend that what was happening was normal. He no longer saw it as love, only as something he wanted to escape. One day, he couldn't take it anymore. Without telling his grandmother, he packed a small bag and left. He went to his friend's house, needing to be somewhere that felt safe, somewhere that didn't suffocate him. His friend noticed right away that something was wrong. Daniel was distant, quieter than usual, his eyes carrying a weight that shouldn't have been there for someone his age. "What's wrong?" his friend asked. Daniel hesitated. How could he explain something he barely understood himself? He forced a smile and shook his head. "Nothing. Just wanted to get away for a bit." His friend didn't push him, but he could tell there was more to the story. Meanwhile, back at home, Elizabeth had heard that Daniel had left Margaret's house. She immediately called him, worry thick in her voice. "Daniel, why did you leave so suddenly? What happened?" He swallowed, gripping the phone. He wanted to tell her everything. He wanted her to know what he had been going through all these years. But how could he? Would she even believe him? His throat felt tight as he struggled to find the right words. "I just wanted to spend some time with my friend," he finally said. It was a lie. But it was easier than telling the truth. Daniel's mother, sensing that something was wrong, gently urged him to come home. She told him that she missed him and wanted him back, hoping that her words would bring him some comfort. But Daniel couldn't bring himself to return. The idea of stepping back into that house, back into the silence and the memories, was too much. He assured his mother that he was fine, that he just needed some time away. Though she remained concerned, she didn't push him. She trusted that when he was ready, he would come back. A few days later, Margaret reached out to him. Her voice was softer than he had ever heard before, filled with what sounded like regret. She told him she was sorry for everything that had happened, that she realized she had made mistakes. She promised him that she had changed, that she would be better. She pleaded with him to come home, swearing that things would be different. Most of all, she told him that she loved him and just wanted them to be a family again. Daniel, still young and desperate for love, wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that people could change, that maybe she really did regret everything. Despite the lingering doubts in his heart, he chose to go back. When he walked through the door, Margaret greeted him with open arms, her eyes bright with relief. She treated him with kindness, spoke to him with warmth, and, for a while, things seemed better. She didn't cross the boundaries that had made him so uncomfortable before, and Daniel began to let his guard down. He thought that maybe, just maybe, things would be okay after all. But just as he started to believe in a new beginning, his life took a devastating turn. A few weeks later, his parents were involved in a car accident. Neither of them survived. The loss shattered Daniel. In an instant, his entire world crumbled. He had no one left, no mother, no father, no home to return to. The grief swallowed him whole, leaving behind an emptiness that nothing could fill. Now, he was completely under Margaret's care. Though she assured him that she would take care of him, that she would manage his parents' wealth responsibly, Daniel no longer saw her in the same way. The years of discomfort, the things she had done to him, made it impossible for him to feel safe around her. He was trapped, bound by grief and circumstance, unable to escape. As he grew older, the resentment in his heart deepened. He hated the way Margaret controlled his life, the way she always twisted things in her favor. He knew she was manipulative. He knew she wasn't the kind, loving guardian she pretended to be. But despite it all, he focused on one thing, building a future of his own. By the time he turned 18, he had met a girl named Grace. She was kind, full of life, and for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt like he had something to look forward to. Their relationship quickly became serious, and Daniel, eager to take a step forward, decided to introduce Grace to Margaret. He thought that maybe, if Margaret met Grace, she would see how happy he was. Maybe it would change things between them. But he was wrong. From the moment Grace walked through the door, Margaret's expression darkened. She looked at the girl with suspicion, her gaze sharp and critical. And then, without hesitation, she spoke. "She's after your money," Margaret said coldly. "That's all she wants. She doesn't love you." Daniel was stunned. He had expected some hesitation, maybe some discomfort, but not outright hostility. "That's not true," he said firmly. "Grace loves me for who I am, not because of my parents' money." Margaret scoffed. "Don't be naive. Girls like her know exactly what they're doing." Grace, standing quietly beside Daniel, looked hurt. She hadn't expected such cruel words from his grandmother. The tension in the room was thick, suffocating, and by the time she left, she was visibly shaken. Daniel was furious. He couldn't understand why Margaret was being so hateful. He knew that Grace had done nothing wrong. The woman who had raised him, the woman who claimed to love him, was doing everything in her power to destroy the one good thing he had. But he refused to let that happen. Despite Margaret's disapproval, Daniel stood by Grace. He loved her, and no amount of cruelty from his grandmother would change that. But things at home only got worse. Every time he mentioned Grace, every time he spent time with her, Margaret lashed out. Her words became harsher, her behavior more erratic. She accused Grace of things that weren't true, twisting stories to make it seem as though Daniel was being used. She wasn't just cruel to Grace, she was cruel to him too. The house became unbearable. The tension, the accusations, the way she controlled every aspect of his life, it was too much. Daniel had spent his whole life feeling trapped under Margaret's influence. But now, he had something to fight for. And he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let her control him any longer. One day, after yet another heated argument with Margaret over Grace, Daniel could no longer hold back his emotions. The frustration, the anger, the years of pent-up resentment, all of it boiled over. His hands trembled as he stood before his grandmother, his voice shaking with rage. "You're a useless mother," he spat, his voice rising. "You're shameless for what you did to me all these years. I'm done. Done with your games, done with the sick nonsense you forced me into." For the first time in his life, he stood up to her. A thick silence filled the room. Margaret's eyes burned with fury, but behind that, there was something else, shock. She had never seen Daniel talk back to her like this. But instead of backing down, she gave him a cold, calculated look. "You better watch yourself," she said, her voice quiet but laced with venom. "If you ever disrespect me like this again, I'll tell everyone what's been going on between us. I'm not ashamed of it, Daniel. I'll ruin you. And you know people will believe me. Who do you think they'll side with? A poor old grandmother, or you?" Her words hit him like a punch to the chest. His heart pounded as the weight of her threat sank in. If she told the world, his life would be over. He had spent years trying to bury the past, trying to forget, and now, the very thought of it becoming public made his stomach twist in fear. How could he face his friends? How could he ever look Grace in the eye if she found out the truth? He felt trapped, paralyzed by the shame that had haunted him for so long. Margaret's lips curled into a smirk. "And you better stay away from Grace. If you don't, I'll make sure she knows everything." Daniel couldn't breathe. The walls were closing in, suffocating him. He had no choice. That evening, he made the hardest decision of his life. He broke up with Grace. When he told her, she was confused, heartbroken. "Why, Daniel? What happened?" she asked, reaching for him, desperate for an explanation. But he couldn't give her one. He couldn't tell her the truth. So he kept his voice cold, distant. "It's over," he said. "We can't be together anymore." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "But why? Did I do something wrong?" He swallowed the lump in his throat, forcing himself to look away. "Just move on." She tried to fight for him, tried to make him talk, but Daniel shut down completely. In the end, she had no choice but to let him go. As she walked away, a deep emptiness settled in his chest. Grace had been the one good thing in his life. She had shown him love, made him feel safe, given him hope. And now, she was gone. The light she had brought into his life was extinguished, swallowed by the darkness Margaret had wrapped around him since childhood. 4 years, he continued to live under her control. Every time he tried to pull away, she would remind him of her threats. The moment he hesitated, she would lower her voice, her words filled with warning. "Do what I say, Daniel. Or I'll tell the world." It never stopped. If he resisted, she would twist the story, making herself look like the victim. "People will never believe you," she would whisper. "I'm your grandmother. Who do you think they'll side with?" And Daniel knew she was right. The world would never see him as the victim. So, every time he tried to fight back, fear stopped him. The shame. The humiliation. The thought of losing everything. It was enough to keep him trapped. Years passed, and though Daniel tried to move forward, the scars never left him. He graduated from school, started working at his father's company, and moved back into his parents' home, which gave him some distance from Margaret. On the outside, he looked like a man who had rebuilt himself. But inside, he was still carrying the weight of everything he had been through. Then, he met Sandra. She was nothing like Grace. Sandra was beautiful, confident, full of life, the kind of woman who walked into a room and demanded attention. She knew exactly what she wanted and how to get it. And she loved luxury. Designer clothes, expensive vacations, fancy restaurants, she lived for it all. At first, Daniel didn't mind. He was captivated by her charm, her energy, the way she made him feel. She was different from anything he had known before. For so long, his life had been weighed down by fear and misery. But Sandra was a breath of fresh air. She made him feel alive again. So he ignored the warning signs. The way she spent money recklessly. The way she always wanted more. Because for the first time in a long time, he felt free. Daniel had spent months with Sandra, and with each passing day, he found himself falling deeper in love. She brought something into his life that had been missing for so long, a sense of normalcy, a future to look forward to. So, when he finally proposed, and she said yes, he felt, for the first time in a long while, that things were finally falling into place. But even with his own home, even with a new life ahead of him, Margaret's presence still lingered like a dark shadow over everything. He knew, sooner or later, he would have to introduce Sandra to her. When the day came, Daniel hoped, prayed, that maybe, just this once, Margaret would let him be happy. Maybe she would accept Sandra. Maybe she would finally let him go. But the moment they left Margaret's house, she made her thoughts painfully clear. "She's spoiled," Margaret said, her voice flat, emotionless. "She's only with you for your money. You're blind if you think she actually loves you. All she sees is what your parents left behind." Her words stung because they echoed some of the doubts Daniel had tried so hard to push away. Despite what Margaret said, Daniel refused to listen. He wanted to believe in Sandra, believe that she truly loved him, that she wasn't just after his wealth. But as time went on, that tiny seed of doubt Margaret had planted began to grow. Sandra's expensive taste, her carefree spending, the way she never hesitated to indulge herself, it all started to weigh on him. Was Margaret right? Was Sandra really in love with him? Or was she in love with what he could provide? Still, Daniel tried to ignore those thoughts. He was determined to make things work. Sandra had moved in, and their wedding was fast approaching. He convinced himself that marriage would be a fresh start, a way to leave the darkness of his past behind. But Margaret wasn't ready to let him go. One afternoon, while Sandra was out, she showed up unannounced. The moment Daniel saw her standing in the doorway, he felt the familiar unease creep into his chest. He had worked so hard to keep his distance, to separate himself from her. But Margaret had a way of appearing when she wasn't wanted, as if she could sense the moments when he was beginning to feel safe. Her sharp eyes swept over the house before landing on him. Then, with a tone so casual it made his stomach turn, she spoke. "Come with me to the bedroom." Daniel froze. Her voice was calm, but he knew what was coming. "You're getting married soon," she continued. "After this, things will be different. But this will be the last time." His breath caught in his throat. "No," he said, his voice low but firm. "No, Margaret. I'm done." For the first time in his life, he felt the anger outweigh the fear. "I'm not doing this anymore," he said, his voice shaking. "You don't control me." Margaret's expression didn't change. And then, just like she always did, she resorted to threats. "If you don't, I'll tell Sandra everything," she said smoothly. "Worse, I'll tell everyone that you pursued me." "Who do you think they'll believe, Daniel? A poor, grieving grandmother? Or you?" Her words sent a cold rush through his veins. She had done this before. He had heard these threats too many times. But now, the stakes were even higher. If she told Sandra, if she twisted the truth, if she made the world believe him to be the monster, what would happen to everything he had worked for? Would Sandra leave him? Would people look at him with disgust? Would he be ruined forever? Daniel felt the panic creeping in, choking him. His fists clenched at his sides. He had spent years fighting to escape Margaret's control, fighting to build a future for himself. But now, in a matter of seconds, it all felt like it was slipping away. He wanted to fight back. He wanted to say no. But in the end, fear won. Like every time before, the shame, the terror, the helplessness crushed him. And just like that, Margaret got what she wanted. Daniel hated himself. Hated how powerless he was. Hated that, no matter how hard he tried, she still owned him. As Daniel lay trapped in the same twisted cycle, something unexpected happened. The front door creaked open. The sound echoed through the house, sending a jolt of panic through him. He turned toward Margaret, who remained calm, her expression unreadable. Sandra had come home earlier than expected, eager to share some exciting news about their wedding plans. But the moment she stepped into the house, something felt off. It was too quiet. Daniel was nowhere to be seen. A strange feeling crept up her spine as she walked through the hallway. Then, she stopped in front of the bedroom door. She pushed it open. The sight in front of her made her heart drop. There was Daniel, with his grandmother. Sandra stood frozen, unable to process what she was seeing. Her mind reeled, trying to make sense of it. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This wasn't something she could explain away. It was real. And it was happening. Shock turned to disgust. Disgust turned to fury. Daniel bolted upright, panic flooding his face. He rushed toward her, his hands trembling. "Sandra, please," he begged. "It's not what you think. I didn't want this. You have to believe me." But she couldn't hear him. The world around her was spinning. She felt like she couldn't breathe. How could this be happening? How could he, the man she loved, the man she was about to marry, be involved in something so twisted? She took a step back, tears welling in her eyes. She wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, but the words wouldn't come out. And then she saw Margaret. The old woman stood in the background, watching everything unfold. There was no shame in her eyes, no remorse. Just a small, knowing smile. Sandra realized, in that moment, that this was exactly what Margaret wanted. She had never planned on letting Daniel be happy. She had spent years controlling him, and now, she had found a way to ruin the one thing that had given him a chance at freedom. Sandra couldn't stay in that house a second longer. She turned and ran, ignoring Daniel's desperate calls for her to come back. She didn't care what he had to say. There was no explanation that could fix this. Daniel collapsed against the door frame, his chest heaving. It was over. Margaret had won. For days, Daniel tried to reach out to Sandra, but she refused to speak to him. She blocked his calls, ignored his messages. The silence was unbearable. Margaret, meanwhile, acted as though nothing had happened. She moved around as if she hadn't just destroyed his life. If anything, she seemed pleased. Daniel sat in his house, drowning in guilt and shame. He had been living a lie for so long, trapped by the manipulation of his grandmother. And now, Sandra, who had once been his escape, had turned into someone else trying to control him. One evening, out of nowhere, Sandra came back. Her face was cold, distant. Without hesitation, she looked him in the eye and said, "It's over." Her voice was steady. Her mind was made up. Daniel had expected this. He had known she wouldn't forgive him. But then she said something that made his stomach drop. "You're going to give me money every month," she continued, her expression unchanging. "Or I'll tell everyone what I saw that day." Daniel froze. His breath hitched. He had thought the worst had already happened. That he had lost everything. But this was something he hadn't prepared for. He fell to his knees, gripping her hands. "Sandra, please, don't do this. You don't understand, I never wanted any of this." His voice cracked with desperation. But she didn't care. Her decision was final. And she knew exactly how to use his fear against him. From that day on, Daniel lived in constant terror. Every month, Sandra called, demanding money. If he hesitated, if he gave less than what she wanted, she would remind him of her threat. He felt like he was suffocating, buried beneath the weight of his past and the endless shame that followed him everywhere. Then, one Sunday, Daniel reached his breaking point. He walked into a church. For the first time in years, he felt something stir in his heart. He sat quietly at the back, staring up at the altar, and prayed. Not just words, real, desperate, broken prayers. He asked for forgiveness, for strength, for a way out. He didn't know what would happen next. But as he stepped outside that day, for the first time in a long time, he felt a small glimmer of hope. As Daniel left the church that day, something unexpected happened. A woman standing outside caught his eye. She had a warm, genuine smile that immediately put him at ease. There was something about her, something peaceful, something pure. She introduced herself as Rebecca, and her voice carried a kindness that Daniel hadn't experienced in a long time. They started talking, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt like he could breathe. There were no expectations, no judgment, just a quiet understanding between them. Over the next few weeks, their friendship grew. Rebecca would sometimes visit him at his house, sitting with him in silence when he couldn't find the words to speak. She never pushed him to share, never demanded answers. Yet, Daniel knew he couldn't keep hiding the truth from her. One evening, he finally gathered the courage. He sat her down and told her everything. The painful memories, the years of manipulation, the fear, the shame, he laid it all bare. He spoke about how it had started when he was just a child, how his own grandmother had controlled and used him for years, how he had lived in fear of her and the threats she wielded over him. He told her about Sandra, about the blackmail, about how he had felt trapped for so long. As he spoke, Rebecca listened quietly. She never interrupted. She never looked away. When he was finished, his voice hoarse and his hands trembling, she finally spoke. "You have to let this go, Daniel," she said gently but firmly. "Not just to me. You need to confess, to God, to the world. You need to be free." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. I don't think I can," he admitted. "What if they judge me? What if they think I'm disgusting? What if?" Rebecca reached out and took his hand. "They won't," she said softly. "And even if some do, it doesn't matter. You need to do this for you. The fear and shame have controlled you for too long. It's time to take your life back." It took him days, weeks, to gather the courage. But the following Sunday, with Rebecca by his side, he stood in church. His heart pounded as he walked to the front, turning to face the congregation. For a moment, he hesitated. Then, he took a deep breath. And he spoke. His voice was shaky at first, but the more he talked, the stronger it became. He told them everything, the abuse, the manipulation, the years of suffering under his grandmother's control. He spoke of how it had destroyed him, how he had lived in fear for so long. When he finished, he braced himself for the worst. But instead of judgment, there was silence. And then, applause. One by one, people stood up, clapping. Not because of what had happened to him, but because he had found the courage to come forward. Because he had confronted his past instead of letting it control him. Daniel's story spread quickly. It went viral on social media, and soon, people everywhere were talking about it. Many condemned Margaret, calling her actions unforgivable. Others, inspired by Daniel's bravery, started speaking out about their own pasts. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt free. The weight he had carried for so long was lifted. He knew the road to healing would be long, but now, he wasn't walking it alone. He had Rebecca by his side. He had the support of his church. And most importantly, he had himself. As for Margaret, the world she had once controlled crumbled around her. She was shunned by the community. People whispered whenever she passed, pointing, murmuring. Doors that had once been opened to her were now closed. One afternoon, she decided to go to the roadside fruit seller, hoping to escape the suffocating loneliness that followed her everywhere. But as she walked through the market, she noticed a group of boys playing nearby. At first, she ignored them. Then, she heard their whispers. Then laughter. One of them pointed directly at her. Her chest tightened. Panic crept up her spine. It was always like this now. Everywhere she went, people either stared at her with disgust or talked behind her back. For the first time in her life, Margaret knew what it felt like to be powerless. And for the first time in his life, Daniel knew what it felt like to be free. As Margaret hurried through the market, her heart pounded. The sound of laughter and shouting behind her made her chest tighten. The boys were running toward her, their voices filled with mockery. She had seen this before. People whispering, staring, avoiding her presence. But this was worse. This was outright humiliation. Margaret felt the weight of her past crushing her. The shame of what she had done to Daniel was now a stain she could never erase. The entire community knew. She was no longer the feared woman who had controlled her grandson, she was nothing but a disgrace. She couldn't face them. She couldn't bear the laughter, the eyes filled with judgment. So she ran. Her feet pounded against the pavement, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Her vision blurred with tears, her only thought being to escape. Escape from the guilt. Escape from the shame. Escape from the truth. But she didn't see the road ahead. A loud honk shattered the air. She barely had time to turn before a speeding car came barreling toward her. The driver slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The impact sent her body flying. She landed with a sickening thud on the pavement. Everything went still. The boys, who had been chasing after her, stopped in horror. The laughter died in their throats as they stared at her lifeless body. People gathered, murmuring among themselves. But no one was surprised. It was as if the whole community had seen this ending coming. Margaret had spent her life manipulating and controlling others, and now, in a moment of fear and panic, she had met a sudden, violent fate. Meanwhile, Daniel was finally free. A few months after Margaret's death, he married Rebecca. The ceremony was simple but filled with warmth and love. Standing at the altar, Daniel felt something he had never known before: peace. He was no longer the broken boy trapped in his grandmother's twisted web. He was a man ready to embrace a future filled with love, hope, and happiness. Rebecca had been a light in his darkest times. Now, she was his partner, the person who helped him believe in something beyond pain. As for Sandra, she had tried to hold on to Daniel, hoping to manipulate him like before. But Daniel had changed. When she realized that he had told the world his story, that he had nothing left to hide, her grip on him slipped away. She had no choice but to stop the blackmail. In a desperate attempt to salvage what was lost, she reached out to him, offering apologies, even suggesting they start over. But it was too late. Daniel had moved on. Sandra became nothing more than a distant memory, a reminder of a time when he had been too afraid to stand up for himself. Now, with Rebecca by his side, Daniel was stronger. He was no longer ruled by fear. He worked hard at his father's company, building a life that was truly his. Every day, he thanked God for the second chance he had been given. His journey had been filled with pain, heartbreak, and shame. But through it all, he had found strength. In his faith. In Rebecca. And most importantly, in himself. The past no longer controlled him. He had let go of guilt. He had found forgiveness, not just from God, but from himself.